Good afternoon, this is Gary Kavanagh here on TRSI. I'm here today with my colleague Michael Dwyer after a bit of a time away, which was mostly predicted and then exacerbated by non-predicted outcomes. Michael, in fact, has COVID, but he's decided to push through it because of his sheer dedication to giving you your weekly news roundup and or forcing me to do this work, one of those things.
All of that and everything else. There's lots of news out there, Gary. A surfeit of news, a surplus, a positive, a gorgement of news. So let's get on to it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic amount. I did want to start with something a bit more lighthearted, Michael.
Yes.
Just a funny little thing to mention. I saw something in the Journal and I saw the headline. The headline was already fantastic, and then I saw the first line and I enjoyed it even more. But the headline was, "Why Ireland's vision of being the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind is in trouble." And, you know, that's the sort of headline you see and you sort of go, is it because we don't stone enough women to death?
Indeed. It's a good question.
Should we be executing homosexuals? I mean, there are many options for why that wouldn't work, but
the science is unclear.
The science is unclear. I mean, should we start doing these things and see, do we move more in the Saudi Arabian direction? Economically.
We should be incremental. Let's start chopping hands and then we'll move on and see if that doesn't work.
I think the public would go for that.
Gary, I think what the public would go for is not necessarily... Anyway, we won't go too far into that.
Yeah, less fox hunting, more executions.
Yeah.
But then I saw the front line of this, the first line. Ireland likes to be big and bold when it comes to future plans. And amongst the biggest and boldest are the government's hopes for offshore wind. And a statement like that is... You know, Michael, we've got to nurture the people who can believe that sort of thing. Their innocence is important. I can't remember the last big and bold project we had. We can't even build a fucking tram network.
Actually, that line of script there has crystallised precisely the problem that we experience in Ireland. See, this nice person has conflated two things, a plan and a hope. And they think that if you have hope, that's the same as having a plan. Because the government hopes lots of things, but doesn't actually plan anything. In fact, this is what, if anything, keeps me up at night, is the absolute lack of a plan of any shape or form. And for example, in the case of energy, I think that they haven't got any kind of a plan for generating medium to long-term electricity. But what they have got, Gary, is lots of hope. They have hope that all of the predictions about what we will get from the renewables and the breakthroughs in technology and the increased efficiency of wind and solar will happen. And all of the negative predictions about extra demand and the requirements of the new digital economy and the cloud and AI, all of that won't happen. That we will get the best possible results on one end from the renewables and the lowest possible outcomes from the negative stuff. And that is the plan. The plan is to hope that the best happens. And after that, listen, if it doesn't, we have nice houses anyway. And it's only poor people that will suffer.
It's one of those fascinating things where, you know, if you're talking to someone about their personal finances, the kind of thing you have to impress upon them is the importance of doing positive things for the future you. And balancing basically how good your life is now with ensuring you have an adequate quality of life when you're older and you're moving towards retirement. Government works the opposite way, where you want to get everything you can now, and the future government is not your problem. You want to make things as bad as possible for them. And so when you see all of these wonderful plans, and like, well, when we're in term, there's going to be a small thing. Like, let's say a small carbon tax, Michael. But then, of course, we're going to have to massively ramp that up when there's another government who conceivably will not be us in power. But it's actually, I'll put a link to this article in the piece, because yes, it's very funny, and it's kind of very journally. There are some interesting things in here, because you can actually see, it's obviously about the government's plans to build up a certain amount of wind generation across the country.
Yeah.
Because this is what we're pinning our hopes and dreams on. And there's lots of good things about wind energy, and there's lots of negative things about it. But this, you can actually, as you read down this, you can see the market breaking apart in real time.
Yeah.
So it starts talking about how we're going to miss all of our targets, and then it says that we're moving to a new plan-led system, Michael, because
plan-led
in the past,
yeah,
companies had applied to build wind farms in different areas on the understanding that the government would guarantee the price.
Correct.
But now we're going to move to a system where the government decides where the offshore wind is going to get built. And why this is interesting is that generally as a market fails, governments will impose more and more control over what's happening, because the general things that would tell you that the market is functioning break down. And bit of a jump here, Michael, but that's what brought down the Soviet Union. The removal of all price signals.
Yeah, no, that's true. Regular listeners will have heard me observe before, while I'm not a fan of government intervention in general, that there are different kinds of interventions, and some of them, social interventions, whatever, these are things you can make a choice about, and as a society we'd say, well, listen, we want to spend our money on this rather than that, and we're willing to sacrifice a point or two of GDP in order to achieve this kind of outcome. And you know what, I think sometimes that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. What you can't get involved in is messing around with the price signals. Because when you start messing around with the price signals, you just lose it, Gary. We just end up, money will go anywhere and everywhere because we won't understand anything anymore. Don't mess around with the price. But they will mess around with the price, Gary. They will.
I suppose actually it's worth explaining what a price signal actually is. Basically, in a competitive market, the price that you can both charge and that consumers will pay lets you know something about the level of that good or service that is required. And it lets you know very quickly if certain goods are oversupplied or whether or not people would prefer certain goods. And what we found is that when you remove that in countries, you start producing goods that actually aren't really useful to the public, or there starts to be massive waste. And it's incredibly impactful in the few areas it's happened. And energy is a massive area for that now, because there's so much regulatory interference in the price structure. So on one hand, you can see the government massively push up energy prices, while on the other having to bring in energy credits for older people who now can't afford energy, which is not really a price signal issue, but more just of an example of general regulatory mess up.
I think it's the easiest way to put it is that the price is a signal. That's what a price is. A price is a piece of information. People sometimes make a fetish of the idea of the market, where the market will decide. The market will decide nothing. The market tells us nothing except the price of things. The market is a mechanism of discovery. And I think it was Wilde, some people said it was Ambrose Bierce, I don't know, that a cynic is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. So the market is a cynic. The market tells us nothing about value. And we shouldn't ask the market about value. The market will tell you about price, what the thing is correctly priced. And in essence, the simplest way to say it is that if the government gets into the business of price, and if it puts the price too high, it will cause scarcity. If it artificially puts the price too high, then it will cause a glut because there will be too much produced. And if it artificially imposes too low a price, like say in the case of rent controls, it will produce a scarcity. So the price itself, we talk about price signals, but the price itself is a signal. And as what happens inevitably when government gets in, they start chasing it. And you have more and more interventions, because as they try to fiddle around with the price system, this will cause more and more downstream problems. And you'll get more and more responses, and the whole thing just becomes like a bag of a mad knitter full of balls of wool intertwined with each other, and you're never going to get them sorted out. It's like when they start printing money, you just have to start printing more and more and more and more. And the thing gets just worse and worse. But it's actually not a bad article, Gary. I mean, their comedy aside, it kind of makes the point, and in fairly decent clarity, the problems that they're facing and why the thing can't really work.
A more accurate description on that would have been, why Ireland's vision of being the Soviet Union of offshore wind is in trouble. But that might have been read as a bit more negatively than the Islamic theocracy.
Yeah, there you go.
Anyway, on economic matters, actually, Michael, there was one story I just wanted to mention. It's kind of funny as well. And it was interesting. It was a story written by Ken Fox, the investigative journalist. And it was about the central bank, Michael, and what the central bank had spent on bringing some bankers over. for an event, and showing them around the place.
Sorry, they're going for a game of golf down in Mount Juliet. Was that it?
Oh yeah, it sounds like a whale of a time.
Lovely.
Altogether, they spent over 350,000. But what I found particularly interesting about this was not what was spent by it. And I'm not one of those people who thinks that entertainment expenses are always undignified or suspect. I think there's actually quite a lot to be said for stuff like this, because we all like to say, policy and procedure are set by logic and facts. A lot of time, personal relationships are incredibly important. So stuff like this I can kind of get behind as long as it's, internally explainable. But what I thought was interesting is where it was reported, because Ken Fox is a highly respected investigative journalist, probably one of the most respected in the country. He regularly writes with multiple papers. And yet, Michael.
Yes?
The only place I saw this reported was LinkedIn. As in, Ken Fox put it up on LinkedIn. Now, I don't know Ken Fox. I get the sense he's not terribly fond of Gript. But I do wonder why someone who could publish in most of the newspapers of the state would cover a story like this, which conceivably you would expect they would think is quite important, on LinkedIn. Unless, Michael, now this is just a guess, he had pitched it to the newspapers and they weren't interested. Which is interesting, I think, isn't it? Why would the newspapers not be interested in a story about, it's bankers spending lavish amounts? People love that sort of stuff.
I didn't get this the first thing. When I heard about this story first, I thought, I didn't know that LinkedIn did a kind of a news service. Like Yahoo and Google, and all these different things, they all have news service like Bing News. I didn't know that yet. And then I understood eventually that, no, it was just a post. Well, that is odd, because let's face it, there is nothing that many Irish readers like nothing than having a good snort over their breakfast reading about bankers wallowing in foie gras and caviar and 100% Egyptian cotton sheets and drinking champagne and pints of Guinness at the taxpayer's expense. They would have a lovely time feeling indignant about that. I would have thought that's the kind of story that any number of newspapers in Ireland would have been very happy to run with, but maybe not.
It was the Governing Council of the European Central Bank and then another 22 officials and support staff, and they spent 117,000 on transport for a 5-day retreat. They also spent nearly $6,000 on notebooks from a handmade leather company. I haven't seen an image of them, but I imagine they look quite nice. Green leather.
The details are always the best bit, but actually I want more detail here. I imagine these are rather lovely hand-made leather covers for your A4 pads. And I think that's a very nice touch. Irish craftsmanship, Irish leather, one hopes. Very nice. The transport thing puzzles me, because I unless everybody was getting a 55-seater bus individually and they were driving it up and down the motorway a few times for their entertainment, or because these were cranky and they couldn't get off to sleep, so decided to put them in the back of the bus, they might fall off to sleep. I'm having to imagine that there were a couple of helicopters involved. And again, Gary, like yourself, I have no problem if you have some big swinging bankers coming in and you want to have a good relationship with them and you want them to feel kindly towards you. When you get down to it, human relationships are actually really important. These things are not done with algorithms and computers at the end. They're made by human beings. Decisions, policy, choices. And if you want them to like you, you try and make a nice time for them. You try and have them happy and thinking, oh God, they're nice guys. Yeah, we won't screw them quite as badly as we screwed them the last time we went in and destroyed their economy. That's the kind of sentiment. So I don't have a problem if somebody has to get a helicopter in. You know what? We spend lots and lots of money on so many stupid and bad things, Gary. It's like people who lose their lives because the TDs get another $5,000 on the salary or something. And you think, really, that's what's worrying you. When was the last time you saw a story on the cost of the children's hospital? That should be a story every day. Every newspaper in Ireland should have a space dedicated, like a little clock. Today, up to today, the Children's Hospital has cost. And the number of days since the asteroid didn't hit, not to rehash old stories, but if you remember, Leo had promised us that absolutely certain the hospital would open, barring an asteroid hit the Earth. When was it, Gary? 2022?
Oh, actually, sorry, I think it was earlier.
I think it might have been actually 2020. Maybe.
I think you're right.
And the asteroid didn't hit, Gary, and yet, lo, the building doth keep being built, and the millions upon hundreds of millions keeps being spent. But people will get upset by this. Anyway, it's a good story.
Yeah, the best stories, Michael, are the ones that give you further questions that you can consider.
Yeah.
And this one certainly did this. The first of those is, I wonder if the central bank often takes out advertisements in the paper.
Ah.
Or I wonder if the central bank is considered of particular interest to the state, which nearly every major paper does receive substantial advertising from, and nearly every major paper is currently trying to convince to fund them directly from public money.
Which will be such a good idea. Because, listen, I don't know why people object to it. It's been a stunning success with RTE. Why wouldn't it be a stunning success with the Independent and the Times and the Journal? And the Examiner. Let's never forget the Examiner. High quality journalism at a low quality price. It's fantastic. But they should all be highly subsidised, Gary. Except for Gript. They shouldn't give any money to that crowd.
Well, I mean, Gript, they have the great advantage there that Gript have publicly declared we won't take public money.
Yeah, but they haven't been
They can actually just say it's available to everyone, and then we're going to have to say no, and they can look as if they were willing to do it, knowing, it's never going to happen.
Yeah, but Gary, you haven't been offered the money yet, and you don't know how much you've been offered. I mean, it's like wait until they come with the baboons and ivories and oxen, and then you can be all pious. It's very easy being a moral man when you've never been asked an immoral question.
Actually, on the spending of government money, there was an interesting story in relation to Israel that broke, I think during the week, maybe the end of last week, probably the start of this week. And Israel had claimed that one of the UN offices had basically, their staff had been involved in the attack on Israel. And whatever you feel about that, it was the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East. Or, if you want something you can actually remember, UNRWA. And again, whatever one thinks about that, the Irish State had a very interesting reaction to that, because certain countries had pulled their funding from the organisation while they were waiting to see, was this true? Had the organisation been infiltrated by Hamas, and had it been used in any way in these attacks?
I think the Germans pulled their money, and the Germans pulled a lot of money.
The Germans pulled, I believe the Americans pulled money as well. So two major funders. We didn't take that. We, in fact, increased our funding.
Oh, yeah.
Because the work was so important, and also because it's Israel saying something. So obviously the Irish government was going to go, well, we don't give a shit about that. Interesting point, though. On Monday, the UN said 9 staff working for that agency will be sacked because they, after an investigation, was believed they were possibly involved in the attack on the 7th of October. So it looks like actually Israel was kind of right on that point. But as I said, I don't really want to focus on the war itself. It's more just how the Irish government spends money in this region, and I would argue in a highly ideological fashion in relation to spending on Palestinian causes. And I remember trying to FOI at the Department of Foreign Affairs to get information on who they were giving money to. Because for years, Israel has been saying that a number of states, European states, and particularly Ireland, have been giving money to organisations that are fronts for Hamas, and that we are therefore directly funding terrorist attacks against them.
Well, no, to be fair, Gary, you should be not just Hamas. I mean, some have been allegations.
That is true.
But some have connections possibly with Fatah, some have connections with Hezbollah. There are a lot of. It's not just Hamas. I mean, the allegations have been spread around to other terror organisations as well.
That is true. There were a number of organisations. And when I tried to FY it and tried to get information more generally, they stonewalled everything and then refused pretty much everything I'd asked for on the basis that revealing that information was likely to cause harm or risk to life of the people that would be named in those documents. Now, given, Michael, that it's public information who is involved in a lot of these organisations, their name being out there on its own wouldn't be sufficient to cause any threat to them. You would in fact have to have something else, possibly linking them to someone else, for you to kind of be able to say, well, that's not the sort of information people should know about.
Yes, reasonable.
I just wanted to, as we were talking about government spending through the central bank, I just want to kind of mention it. And our Micheál Martin's sort of, no, we're going to spend even more.
Yeah, because we're big boys and we can do what we want and we're not going to listen to those. We're going to stand up and we're going to be an example to the world, Gary, like the president.
I'm just going to make the general point that if you ever argue for anything that involves increasing funding to a UN office, you've already gone badly astray.
Badly astray.
Doesn't matter what the office is. Unless maybe it's involved in polio eradication. Maybe then. Everything else, no.
I thought we had eradicated polio.
Actually, no. But there is a lot of good work going on. For many years, actually, all across the world on it.
Well, I'm in favour. I say we. These days I'm very busy, Gary. I don't have that much time for my polio work anymore. But I do support those who are engaged in that. But, yeah, I would support. I knew guys and gals who worked for UNESCO and did some good stuff. And I knew some people who actually worked in the middle of what's the medical one? WHO. And actually went out and sort of did hands-on work, not the people at the top who seemed to make a balls of our last pandemic a little bit. But there you go. But otherwise, yeah, if giving money to the UN is generally speaking an indication that you've put down your moral map and you can't find it.
Actually, on Gaza and polio, there was a note during the week that they plan to send over 1 million polio vaccines to Gaza because the virus was detected in the water there. And the head of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, a guy called Aidan O'Leary, who's actually the brother of the head of the Referendum Commission, Art O'Leary, died during the week.
Oh, I saw that, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's still an active matter. On two kind of final economic things, Mike. There were two things I thought that came out that were quite interesting this week on the Irish economy. One was a new report from the CSO looking at Ireland's trade figures. Extremely bad. Extremely bad. But one was a proposal by Minister Peter Burke, which asked a question, Michael. Always wonderful when policy asks a question.
Jesus.
So the minister has asked, is a €750 tax credit for people under 25 enough to stop them from leaving the country? To which I think the answer is a very simple no. That seems quite direct.
I kind of felt sorry for him because my initial sense was a bit sorry. I thought, well, is this the kind of thing that you say, you have an idea, you throw it out, and you don't really think about it that much because on the face of it, it's just so stupid that somebody who's leaving the country. Okay, you got certain people who are afraid that we care about, apparently, desperately. Dentists and doctors and vets who can go to other countries and maybe get better professional experience and or earn lots more money with better conditions and better hours and whatever. And we care about that. And the other thing, we got a lot of young people, and at least that's my anecdotal experience, a lot of young people, mostly young men, who are going to America or to Canada, but lots and lots of them going to Australia, Gary, to work in the mines or in things related to the mines because you can get savage money. And the work is probably hot and probably quite hard, but these are young men who are used to working in shitty conditions for not a whole lot of money or reasonable money, but they don't mind a bit of hot for a year or two. The idea that 750 quid of a tax credit is going to make a 25-year-old welder think, no, I'm not going to go off to the Northern Territories for 2 years to see what is. No, it's just. And then you look at the story and there's the photograph and he's standing there and let's give young people 750 tax credit to help them. Keep them in Ireland longer, says Fine Gael minister. And you think, no, this was just a very, very bad idea. Because it's not that the idea itself is a bad idea, which it is. It's not so much a bad idea, it's just a small idea, an irrelevant idea. Gary, does it not also suggest to the voter, we have no ideas, by the way. We have gone to the barrel, we have scraped the bottom, we have looked around, and this is what we came up with.
Yeah, I think when you're describing a €750 tax credit only for under 25s as a huge tax credit, not really. Also, I would be very interested on whether or not this is legal to do. A lot of the legislation related to age discrimination says that you can do certain things to people under 18 or above, I think, 60 or 65 in order to basically allow retirement to happen or forced retirement in certain civil service positions. But anything in between those can start running into legal issues quite quickly. So I don't know enough about this to say for certain, but my immediate thought was, I wonder if that's legal. But also, I think taxation obviously has an impact on people coming into the country. I think the most important impact is probably the employment rate.
Yeah.
And the overall economic growth. But if you're looking for actual issues that may stop people from leaving the country, it's very clear that the marginal rate is a lot of the issue. And the point it comes in is way too low by international comparison, and it's way too high. The jump from the lower rate to the higher rate is incredible. And you compare that to someone who can go to America, whether or not they're a programmer or a doctor or they're in the trades, can look at earning substantially more, oftentimes more than twice what you would earn in this country, and pay a substantially reduced tax bill, and can go to places where there's sun and people actually enjoy you succeeding.
Yeah.
So I just don't see how this moves the needle one way or the other. Anyone who is convinced by this was highly unlikely to leave anyway. And
nobody's being convinced by this, and I don't think it moves the needle. I think politically what it does is it clearly tells you that as a party or as a government, they are out. They're empty. They are running on fumes, and they're just desperate to get to the election before Sinn Féin works out what the hell to do about getting their vote back, or somebody else, some other monster rises up, some kraken from the deep arises to threaten what at the moment looks like a fairly predictable re-election, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and other people. But they are just out. And if this is the level of creativity and thinking that's going on, it's not great.
I mentioned before about driving up the price of energy and then having to bring in energy credits because you basically need to counteract your own policy.
Yeah.
Because it has such obvious consequences. And I should say, on the energy credits, there seems to be this sort of, we're going to look at that, as opposed to, well, yes, we clearly knew this was going to happen. So it seems like they don't even understand the impact of their own policies often. But if you put this on one side, Michael, the 750 tax credit, and on the other side, put the auto-enrollment pension plan that's about to be rolled out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the thing about the auto-enrollment pension plan is that it's going to make it more expensive to employ people. So you would expect some dip in employment. At the rate it's at initially coming in, probably relatively small. It starts at, I think, an additional 1%. And for those who aren't aware, the government, basically because the pension system is a Ponzi scheme, which is basically about to become non-operational over time because we're not having enough new births, have decided that they'll bring in a system where everyone who is earning at least 20,000 and is between 23 and 60 will be auto-enrolled into a state-run pension scheme unless they opt out themselves I think you can opt out for 6 months, or they have some other system in place with their employer or PRSA where they have a pension already. And the thing that I don't think that's been talked about there is that it's going to make everyone's wages worth less because a percentage of your wages are going to be taken away. Yeah. It starts at 1%, and then I think it scales up to 6%. But that's over, I think 10 years to get to that point.
Yeah.
And at that point, an employer is paying 6%, you're paying 6%. So all of your wages are worth less. So you have that on one hand, Michael, and the estimates for how much that will cost you once we get to the 6% is €1,200 a year. So, and that's if you're earning 20,000. So if you're earning, an actual livable wage, a full-time wage, it's going to cost you much more than that.
Yes.
So on one hand, we have, we're going to give them this tax credit to come in, but we're also doing this thing which could cost them 3 or 4 times the tax credit. And I don't think this scheme, by the way, is going to work. I've talked to people who I respect and are knowledgeable about this area who tell me it will work and they think it has to be done. I think the expected returns on it are too low, and I think it won't function. Everyone will have a pension, but they'll have a shit pension. And to be fair, in the end, that actually doesn't really matter. It won't make enough to actually pay what it requires to. And I think also arguably, Michael, it comes in too early. I know a lot of people recommend that you start a pension as early as possible. I don't think so. I think you should probably start a pension in your 30s, in your early 30s possibly, because your income raises steadily for most people over your 20s and then kind of takes off substantially in your 30s. And in your 20s, you have other stuff you want to do that you probably need to have as much of your cash available for, such as trying to get a house.
Yeah.
And this, I think, will actually interfere with that quite substantially. But that's a kind of matter of professional disagreement, I suppose. But it's just an example, I think, of, on one hand, we're going to loudly give you something, while on the other, setting it up to take more from you and think that this thing will do something and that the thing we're taking from you will have no impact.
Well, I'd say 2 things about observations I'm passing. First of all, whether or not there will be enough generated from this to, I think you're being either kind or naive in assuming that just because they started with the plan to go from 1 to 6%, that's where it'll stay. I think it's perfectly reasonable to believe that once you have introduced the thing and people have accepted the thing on principle and they've kind of got used to it, well, then you bump it. And they keep bumping it until it reaches the point where it becomes financing. Something, Gary, has to be done. And we are in a better position than a lot of other countries are because of our historic demographics. Our demographics going forward are bad. But up to now, we've been in a better position with our demographics. So we're getting in on this problem a little bit earlier. There are solutions to this. Similar things have been done in Singapore and things, and we need some way of financing it. The other thing is, as regards the policy conflict, but that is absolutely symptomatic. There's a weird thing, and the voter doesn't get it enough. I think that's a deliberate policy question. The whole energy thing. The government wants to believe that in some sense, your energy costs going up is kind of a glitch. When in fact it is the whole purpose, because they want everything to be more expensive, because the purpose is to get you to use less of it. They're using price signals, Gary. As we all know, they're telling you, this has got more expensive, so normally speaking, when things become dearer, we use less of them because we want to get net zero, we want to cut emissions, and we want to be good green people. Why you would introduce a policy which is successful insofar as by making something so much more expensive that you can only afford to consume 80% of what you previously consumed, and then go, oh my God, our policy has been successful. Let's try and find a way around that. Let's try and find a way of fixing our successful policy. To me is, one of the weirdest things you can see a government doing, but they're doing a lot of it.
It reminds me of a couple of years ago. There was the latest sort of policy that would increase the energy efficiency of Irish houses. We were already the highest. We already had the highest standards on new builds in the European Union.
Yeah.
So we were going above that. And when, I can't remember which minister announced it, but there was a sort of, this will only have a small impact on house prices. I think the estimate was it might add 10,000 to the cost of building a new house. And this was at the same time that we were having a massive push to make housing more affordable. And you kind of feel like you have to sit down with people and go, yes, but you see, if you keep putting in place measures that each increase the housing cost by 10,000, people can't afford houses at the end of it. And this should be obvious, but apparently this isn't. And there was a great discussion at the time about how a lot of the analysis of this had looked at the total cost of home ownership, and it basically worked out that the reductions in energy cost meant that housing had become more affordable because you were reducing the amount of energy that would be required to run the house. And again, you kind of felt you had to sit down with people and go, yes, but that doesn't matter if people can't afford the house to begin with.
It means that the house becomes cheaper when you've had it for 35 years. But I don't have the house yet. I'm trying to buy the house now. So making it 10,000 more expensive now, that's a problem for me. Because, I think we looked at the figures, didn't we, guys, that by an addition of 10,000, 20,000, whatever it was, that you automatically removed X percentage of people from the market.
Yeah, we had a number of conversations about it with people involved in policy and who really should have known better, who took the revelation that if the upfront cost increases, it doesn't matter if there are cost savings over the long tail because people can't afford the upfront cost as this sort of, oh, never thought about that.
But
they probably should have.
The response I got consistently was they would look at you and say, you know, what you're advocating is a reduction, therefore, in standards. Well, yes, of course, sometimes when you increase standards, there will be an increase in costs. And it's like they use this word standards like a prophylactic. Oh no, you're advocating for reductions in standards. It almost implying that you wanted to see people back to the kinds of tenements you'd find in the lanes off Bagot Street circa 1900, you know.
Michael, even worse, the modern tenements, co-living spaces.
Oh no.
Because who would want an area where you could live comfortably at a reasonable price and, you know, designed on the thought that perhaps you might do a lot of stuff outside the house because you live in a city and are young and possibly working for a consultancy firm. There was a
horrible suggestion that they were going to build some of those shared living spaces somewhere around the docks area, the port, in the north inner city. They were going to build those. And thank God sense prevailed. And instead, the people who would have lived there, the young people that would have lived there, have perfectly nice apartments in Athlone from which they commute to Connolly.
Or can, you know, agree that a couple of them will live in an apartment together and can directly compete with families.
Oh yeah, which is a good thing, of course.
Super.
Yeah.
A clear sign of a policy win. And as I said, there was some CSO figures that came out today that indicate, Michael, that the just a couple of items of concern, I would say. These were on on trading.
Yeah.
And exports. And it was the CSO's profile of trading enterprises 2022. The headline figure of it is that just 5 enterprises in the country export 44% of the total value of goods in 2022. That's not good. That's a very high level of concentration. I suspect that is the high-level multinationals who are involved in, you know, service exports, basically. And they have a massive distortionary impact on all of our stats. So it's hard to tell, you know, what the actual underlying issue there is. But one thing that is quite bad is foreign-owned enterprises accounted for 87% of total exports and 73% of total imports. Why this is not great is because it highlights some of the dependency upon the multinationals, clearly. And what we have seen in America particularly is we've seen Donald Trump talking about lowering corporation tax to, I think, 13%. The standard response to that I've seen in policy circles so far is that he, even if he gets in, he won't be able to do that. I think if you look at the reduction he was able to get in his first term, it would actually be pretty reasonable to assume he will be able to get that done. And we've also seen, even from the Democrats, a lot of conversations about forcing their multinationals to move their cash piles back to America and to centralize a lot of their functions back in America on the basis that basically these companies have been using regional corporate tax rates in order to avoid actually bringing the money back to America and paying the tax due on it. That would be bad for us.
Fragility. Everything that I look at when I look at the different sets of stats, Gary, around the economy suggests fragility. Now, you can end up going down rabbit holes and being a doomster and think it's all going to end horribly. But the phrase that used to be the beginning of every discussion of the Irish economy up to 2008 was asymmetric shock. Ireland is a small, thriving, open, trading, exporting economy, which leaves it unusually exposed to asymmetric shock. Well, the thing is, eventually the asymmetric shock happened and the Irish economy went pear-shaped for all sorts of different reasons. Now, every war is different, Gary. So, we make the mistake of preparing for the next crisis on the basis of the last crisis. But if we take one industry, right, which has become an issue recently, and I don't know if our policymakers, I hope that they are aware of this, but the pharmaceutical industry, Gary, has become something of a talking point in the United States as regards our trade, the American trade deficit in pharmaceuticals. The United States imports very large amounts of pharmaceuticals, drugs, and what they call medicaments from Ireland. And there are, if you can chart the total amount that's coming in. Now, that has become increasingly a problem. There's a significant pharma lobby in the United States. There are issues. Pharma, drugs, imports, costs, all these things are very much part of the American political discourse. We don't want to become part of any American political discussion, Gary. The Irish economy does not need to start coming up, because if the Americans start looking at the Irish economy, they may start getting very negative feelings about us that we don't want them to have. They may look, for example, about the way that Apple and other tech companies might use their licensing agreements between Apple Ireland and Apple in the United States, and tech companies and pharma companies where they hold their profits and how those profits are not being repatriated. And, for example, politicians may start looking at schemes where profits can be repatriated without penalty. The United States doesn't send businesses out to countries like Ireland because, for the same reasons why people who make fabrics or textiles sent their manufacturing out to Hong Kong or Malaysia, and then from Malaysia and Hong Kong they sent them to Vietnam, and from Vietnam they sent them to Laos. It wasn't about cost, it was about other issues. If they wanted to repatriate all of the manufacturing, say in stuff like pharma and tech, into the United States, they could do so. If productivity is not an issue, cost is not an issue. I don't know, Gary, but even though wages in the United States are higher, the global gross cost of labour in Ireland may be higher than in the United States.
I think your point on fragility is well made. The multinationals have distorted the state, I think, economically and politically to an incredible extent. anything that threatens them is not just a threat to those who are directly employed by them, but to the entire country, because the contagion effects of a large multinational pulling out, or a number of them pulling out in a roughly similar time frame, would be so devastating. And it's something that people often forget. When employment doesn't just benefit those employed, it benefits those who can sell services or goods to those who are employed. So one source of employment brings others together. You know, the building of a plant will create more business for people who have shops nearby. I will create more business for people who want to build houses nearby. There's massive knock-on effects to large employers coming or going. And I think in relation to the multinationals, they have become such an integral part of the Irish economy that were they to go, it would simply... It's hard to describe how bad it could be in terms that are not frankly apocalyptic.
Intel is downsizing, right? Which means it's getting rid of people. Now, if Intel was to take a sizable hit in West Dublin, for example, that would have a massive impact on the economy of Lucan and of Western generally. If you started to see companies like Intel, like Google, like PayPal, like whatever, starting to either to reduce or to move, the short-term impact will be bad, but the long-term impact, our economy has become so dependent. And on the other side of this, Gary, there is a terrible, let's hope, justified, naive optimism which we see in the government. If anybody wants to look at the Financial Council, the Financial Council, and what is the Fiscal Advisory Council, we are looking at very significant overruns in spending already. They're talking at health is already overspent at 1.4 billion, and if it continues as at the moment, it will be over 2 billion. We are heading into an election where I confidently expect we're going to see some goodies handed out. Now, this has been done, Gary, on the back of, after a little dip, a return to very strong growth in corporate tax receipts. Mm-hmm. Corporate tax receipts have now overtaken VAT and are the second largest source of tax revenue to the state, which in itself should be a concern. That we are back to the thing where back in 2007, 2008, over 20% of the tax rates coming into revenue were coming directly from the housing industry, the construction industry. We are now actively rather than passively dependent on that. We are absolutely dependent for revenue from the taxation point of view on these companies, as well as for employment and for the downstream effects that those well-paid jobs, because again, Gary, you've seen the figures as well. The difference between the average wage of an FDI employed person in Ireland and somebody who's employed in the private sector in a domestic company is very significant.
It is, and I think part of the problem here is the nature of the multinational involvement and the scale of it. The direct employment is obviously massive. The direct contribution to corporate tax rate is incredible. But when you start branching that out to people who are to other employments which are dependent upon those employed in the multinational or the presence of the multinational, it starts becoming significant percentages of the country very, very quickly. And I think part of the problem here is when you say, okay, well, how do you counteract that? You counteract that by with an indigenous SME sector that you push to grow and then get large enough to export.
Yeah.
The problem I think we have is that I think that the presence of the multinationals has basically caused something akin to a Dutch disease in the Irish economy. And Dutch disease is very difficult to deal with. For those who aren't aware, Dutch disease refers to a situation in which one sector of your economy starts to become extremely successful, effectively, out of sync with the rest of the economy. and it starts drawing in massive amounts of capital and human resources and all of those things, forcing other sectors of the economy, which are not performing at that level, to change how they operate in order to basically pull in staff and to continue operating. It effectively distorts an entire nation's economic circumstances. And I think that's what the multinationals have done, both directly and because of the businesses they've allowed to crop up because of their presence. It's very hard to deal with as well. Devastating potentially in the long run, because it can do all sorts of things related to making exports more expensive and things like that.
In the short term, there's nothing you can do about it. But what you can do in the short term is set up the conditions which will, in the short to medium term, that these companies don't leave. So, without having to go back to long dead horses and beat them yet again, I will say this government needs to get its finger out and start to get a proper strategic plan to guarantee energy and supplies in this country. And I suppose, I really mean electricity, which at the moment it doesn't have. And if we do not have a situation where we can significantly expand our production of electricity and guarantee electricity supply to tech companies, in the medium to short term, they are going to start to leave. And what they are most certainly going to do is they're going to stop investing. And they're going to start looking elsewhere. And that would be a very bad thing. In the long term, we have to look at the fact that the fiscal structure of Ireland has, as you say, Gary, been developed in response to the needs of foreign direct investment. And back when Charlie Hyde was doing this in 1988, and before that, when Lamass and Whittaker were doing it in the 60s, that was understandable and it was a good idea. But we have to take away those fiscal roadblocks which are stopping the development of domestic economy. And there is no doubt that they're significant. ISME has written many well-researched, well-pointed papers on the subject. Anybody can go and read them. But at the moment, I think in the short term, that's a medium long-term project. Right now, we just need to make sure that the guys that are here stay as long as we can. And in the absence of a strategic long-term policy for energy generation, amongst other things, we're going to look at a situation where they're going to start to leave. And even if they leave little bit by little bit by little bit, as they say, it'll happen slowly and then it'll happen all of a sudden. And it'll be a nightmare.
I don't think it's a coincidence that as the multinationals have become more and more integrated into the country and more people have become dependent upon them, both directly and indirectly, our government seems to have gotten less and less effective. I think if we're talking about Dutch disease, and it's not exactly Dutch disease, but it's a close enough analogy, and we look at the politics of it, I think having a massive sector which is largely insulated from your policy choices, but can prop up basically per choices and cover them up, allows governments to get less and less effective, just less and less good, basically. And I think looking at the current government, not just the government, but TDs in general, they're some of the least quality people, just on a general skill set level, I think we've ever had in the Dáil. And I think what's happening basically is we're seeing the impact of politics basically being insulated from the consequence of their action. In the same way a price signal lets you know what you should do with goods and whether or not they're being over or under demanded, and basically decide what you should do with it without waste. We've kind of removed that from politics as well. And you tie that with a population which is very fond of voting for the same people regardless of what those people do, and you don't have a good combination. You've seen, I think, certain countries be able to avoid this because they have a different political culture than we have. But I think all of this is going in one direction, and it is not a good direction. It'll be kind of okay until it hits a point, and then it'll just go to absolute hell.
It'll be okay. It will be okay right on to the point when it just is not okay anymore. And the problem is that we are coasting, essentially, on the back of the success of the creativity of the American tech industry. And that has been incredibly creative and incredibly successful. And by a stroke, not pure luck, but some luck, they are here. The pharma industry also, and other industries as well, but particularly tech and pharma and American tech and American pharma have been incredibly successful, incredibly creative, and we have been there and we have collected by accident. It's like somebody who happened to inherit a piece of land where there was a toll booth, and one day suddenly all this traffic was directed along that road, and we never expected it. But we're standing there, and we just collect all the silver as it goes by, and it doesn't really matter what we do because the money keeps coming. But one day, someday, Gary, somebody might build another road. Anyway, on that cheerful note,
just on that point, an important way that this has changed over the last few years is that the political and policy ineptitude has now extended into areas that actually do relate to multinational functioning. So things like energy policy, things like planning policy.
Yes.
These are now also impacting upon the companies we have basically decided to make ourselves entirely reliant on. So the consequences of that are unlikely to be good over a long period. And there are also things that could be fixed. The planning issues could be fixed. Policies could be changed. The planning system could be changed. But it seems that the people who are there now are unable to do so. So we've started actually hurting our own relations with the sector we most need, which would kind of seem to be laying you up for a loss of part of that sector's, even ignoring the wider kind of geopolitics of this, which are also going in a very particular direction.
Well, I'm going to go and drink some Ribena and lie on my bed. And we will be back, assuming we're all alive and hale and hearty, on Sunday. Have a lovely week, and we will see you then.
All the best.